Okay, well, we're part way through chapter 3, and we've reached Becker's discussion of the term anality, and he uses that term to, as a label, I should say, for that aspect of the human condition, or let's say that aspect of humans that is strictly biological, animal, etc. So it's our animal biological side. Like take out all the spiritual stuff, take out all the symbolic stuff. When you look at humans purely as procreating, defecating, secreting, dying animals, well, the term anality is used to describe that aspect of the human condition. It's a quote on page 32. I want to direct your attention to. And from the top of page 32, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about 12 lines down, we read that men of the Chaga tribe wear an anal plug all their lives, pretending to have sealed up the anus and not to need to defecate, an obvious triumph over mere physicalness. Or take the widespread practice of segregating women in special huts during menstruation and all the various taboos surrounding menstruation, and they are universal, by the way. In fact, in my course on the anthropology of gender, sexuality, and patriarchy, I have a unit labeled menstruation hysteria to refer to how cultures have attempted to deal with menstruation. And to continue that quote, various taboos surrounding menstruation, then colon, it is obvious that man seeks to control the mysterious processes of nature as they manifest themselves within his own body. The body cannot be allowed to have the ascendancy over him. Look at the very bottom, page 32. The upsetting thing about anality is that it reveals that all cultures, all men's creative life ways, are in some basic part of them a fabricated protest against natural reality. A fabricated protest against natural reality, a denial of the truth of the human condition, and an attempt to forget the pathetic creature that man is. Now, he also discusses the concept of the anal personality. The anal personality. Sometimes people will joke that so-and-so is so anal, so we often use it as a kind of put-down. But in the context of Becker, we can really understand what is meant by the anal personality. Because think about it. The anal person, in common terms, is someone who is overly fastidious about their appearance. They're always neat and prompt, and everything is just so. Well, these are all qualities or practices that all of us engage in to some extent, right? Even the quote-unquote normal person does these things. But what's important here is that the anal person, for whatever reason, needs to do more of these things. So in other words, they need more culture than the rest of us. Right? The normal person needs a certain amount of culture to cope. The anal person needs a lot more culture to cope. So they are highly culturized. So the important thing here is that there's not a qualitative distinction between the normal person and the anal person. It's more of a quantitative thing. The anal person simply needs more culture to make themselves feel comfortable for whatever reason. Okay, still in chapter 3, Becker discusses sexual guilt. And of course, by now you should be able to understand how Becker is going to, or you should be able to guess how Becker is going to interpret sexual guilt. After all, it is sex that, on the one hand, is a strictly mechanical, biological, animal act. In fact, we can use the term that ethologists use, people who study animals, copulation, which just simply refers to the sex act. Right? So on the one hand, there's just raw animal, biological, organic sex called copulation. And that is part of it, no matter how we dress it up. Right? And dress it up we do. I mean, just look at all the courting rituals and all of the ideas regarding marriage and gender behavior and sexual do's and don'ts. There's a mountain of these ideologies that exist in the world's cultures. So clearly, once again, we don't let nature, in the form of copulation, have the last say. We step in and we try to make that act meaningful. Because we need to. Why? Because it represents nature in its rawest, starkest form. So we must do something about that. So that's sexual guilt. And the responses to it, of course, would be all the cultural responses, the ways we try to attenuate it or minimize the problems caused by the fact that we're reminded once again that we're just natural, biological, organic beings. And of course, that is rather difficult because, as he mentions, the sexual urge is one of the strongest urges that we have. So we're in a constant battle with sexuality. Relevant here is the discussion is of what he calls morality police. And you can tell from the term pretty much what he means by that. Morality, morality police. These are individuals who are extra vigilant in regard to guarding our do's and don'ts regarding sexual morality, sexual perversions, etc. So they are trying extra hard to control and minimize our animal biological side. It's a quote on page 45. Look at the very bottom of page 45. By the time the child grows up, the inverted search for a personal existence through perversity gets set in an individual mold, and it becomes more secret. It has to be secret because the community won't stand for the attempt by people to wholly individualize themselves. Right? You must buy into the community project, that project that we're using to stand up against nature. To continue, if there is going to be a victory over human incompleteness and limitation, it has to be a social project, not an individual one. Society wants to be the one to decide how people are to transcend death. It will tolerate the causae sui project only if it fits into the standard social project. Otherwise, there is the alarm of anarchy. This is one of the reasons for bigotry and censorship of all kinds over personal morality. People fear that the standard morality will be undermined. Another way of saying that they fear they will no longer be able to control life and death. So it must not be challenged. Their project that they're engaged in to stand over against nature must be supported, and it must not be challenged. So these morality police basically guard that space, so to speak. And they mentioned sexual perversion, which I think is a topic we're going to take up a little bit later. But it is this group that basically oversees the determination of what is good or bad sexually, what will be censored, what will be allowed, and so forth. Okay, chapter 4, the title is Human Character as a Vital Lie. That title tells us a lot, because he calls human character a lie. Well, because human character, this is what we use, once again, to give our lives meaning. So remember, always keep in mind, the truth of things, the reality of things is found in nature. He notes that one's lifestyle is a vital lie, as I said from the title, because it's a necessary and it's a basic dishonesty about oneself and one's situation, right? We don't live in nature in an ingenuous, forthright, honest, frank way, right? We attempt to trick ourselves, to fool ourselves into thinking that our cultural response is real rather than nature being considered to be real. So it is a lie, but it's also vital. Well, why is it vital? Well, because otherwise, if we were to go without it, we would totally expose ourselves to reality and we would go mad. There's a quote on page 56, and it's 3 lines from the bottom of the page. It reads, "It is fateful and ironic how the lie we need in order to live dooms us to a life that is never really ours." You should understand that by this point, right? So the lie we need in order to live is our culture, our religion. We have to have these things to be normally functioning psychological individuals. But having these things, quote, dooms us to a life that is never really ours, unquote. Why? Well, because we didn't create this culture. We didn't create this religion. We were born into it. We're simply borrowing it, or we're simply buying into it. Right? It is totally out of our hands, totally beyond us. It is not really part of us at all. It comes from somewhere else. It was here before we got here. It'll be here after we leave. So we're living a life that's not really ours. Okay, page 60, a nice quote. Drop down 7 lines from top of page 60. "It can't be stressed one final time that to see the world as it really is devastating and terrifying. It achieves the very result that the child has painfully built his character over the years in order to avoid. It makes routine, automatic, secure, self-confident activity impossible. It makes thoughtless living in the world of men an impossibility. It places a trembling animal at the mercy of the entire cosmos and the problem of the meaning of it." A nice summary quote for a lot of what we've been talking about. Toward the end of that chapter, chapter 4, he notes that one of the major ironies of human existence is the fact that one of the most important needs is to be free from the anxiety of death and annihilation, but yet it's life itself that awakens this fear. So in other words, we must become less than fully alive. We psychologically, we couldn't bear being fully alive in this natural world. Look at page 66. The quote right below the block quote there, the text right below the block quote, page 66. The irony of man's condition is that the deepest need is to be free of the anxiety of death and annihilation, but it is life itself which awakens it, and so we must shrink from being fully alive. Why? Because we can't bear the psychological distress and intellectual distress caused by living in nature as natural biological beings. Okay, chapter 5, he discusses Soren Kierkegaard, which if you know anything about Kierkegaard, you will find somewhat curious. Kierkegaard was a 19th century Christian Protestant theologian, but also considered to be one of the first existentialists. Existentialism explores what it means to be an individual living in the world. Well, with Kierkegaard, we get this notion of the inauthentic person. The inauthentic person. In other words, someone who is a slave to culture. And this should make sense by this point, right? Because if you, for example, were born in New Delhi, India, and you've been a Hindu your whole life, well, what did you do? Well, you simply assimilated the culture and religion you were born into. You made no contribution to it. You made no changes to it. You simply accepted it. So you're a slave to that culture, which can be said about the majority, the vast majority of individuals, which makes us inauthentic, right? Where's the individual there? There's a sort of continuum that Becker discusses here in this chapter. At one end, you have depressive psychosis. And this is a result of someone that has too much culture. So the individual has pretty much suffocated. The individual has been snuffed out. Culture is totally ruling their lives. There's no input from the individual. And so a term that's used here is depressive psychosis. That would be, let's say, at the extreme left end of a continuum that represents too much culture. Now, if you go to the extreme right end of that same continuum, and of course it's based on the amount of culture, so the extreme left end is way too much culture. The extreme right end would be no culture. And we could put the schizophrenic there. An interesting way to look at schizophrenia, because it does represent someone who is out of touch with cultural reality. In fact, they're so out of touch with cultural reality, they essentially create one for themselves. So it's like the ultimate expression of individuality. So that would be found on the extreme right of the continuum that represents no culture. So these people are no longer grounded in their culture at all. It's an interesting way to look at schizophrenia. Kierkegaard notes that most people live in a state of normal neurosis. Now, remember, neurosis is not quite as extreme as the psychosis. Neurosis is just a sort of minor kind of psychological distress, right? A minor estrangement from reality. Well, as a normal person, quote unquote, you're inauthentic. By the way, that continuum we were just talking about, and you should be sketching this, that continuum we're talking about would have the inauthentic person right in the middle. That would represent quote-unquote normal people. And they live in a state of normal neurosis, according to both Kierkegaard and Becker. In that, yes, even the normal person has accepted culture to some extent and religion to some extent, so therefore we are to some extent estranged from the natural way of things, estranged from reality. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this continuum when we pick it up in part 3. We're still in chapter 5.